It's a pleasure to welcome you here this evening. This is the last of the Jean Monnet events that are being organised this year, and rather last minute because of the calling of European Parliament elections when we least expected them. To that end, we're having a debate. Tonight's event is co-funded by the Erasmus Plus programme of the European Union, and I'm delighted to welcome to that debate six candidates, one from each of the six main parties, and in a moment I'll ask each of them to introduce themselves. What we'll do is we'll have a quick introduction across the table where each candidate will introduce themselves and say what their political priorities are, both for themselves and for their party in these elections, and then after that we'll move to questions from the floor, and hopefully finish at some time between 7:30 and 8 o'clock, all being well, and we hope, of course, to generate many questions from the discussion. So perhaps I can move to ask the candidate furthest from me at the end of the table to introduce himself first of all, and if each candidate could speak for about 3 minutes in order to outline who they are and what their political priorities are.
My name is Neathey, and I'm one of Labour's candidates in the European elections for the South East. I thought I should start by telling you a bit about who I am and how I got here. I graduated from university at the height of the financial crisis, and despite having a first-class honours degree, which many of you will be working towards a degree for sure, and despite having years' worth of work experience, I was left without a job. In fact, I spent the better part of a year without a job. Over that time, I applied for hundreds of jobs, and if I was lucky enough to get an interview, the same question would always come up: what are you doing now? And I have to say, well, I'm looking for work, actually. But I have some, please. And invariably, I wouldn't get the call back. The last Labour government had something called the Future Jobs Fund that put me back to work on a 6-month paid placement. And when I was interviewed for work for afterwards, the dreaded question came up. But I was able to say, well, actually, I'm working in a charity in Egham as a researcher. Now, I've gone on to have a successful career in the private sector. I own my own home. But I think everything has come down to that one opportunity the last Labour government gave me. When the Tories and the Liberal Democrats came to power as part of the coalition, the second or third thing they announced they were going to cut was the Future Jobs Fund. And at that point, I knew I needed to fight. I needed to fight to make sure that nobody was ever left in the economic scrap heap of history again. I needed to fight for the Labour Party. However, I think we've reached a stage where the Tories, or at least some of them anyway, and the Brexit Party are willing to put the entire South East region on the economic scrap heap of history. Prosperity in this region is entirely underpinned by our membership of the EU, whether that be the flexibility that comes from freedom of movement, providing seasonal workers for our rural areas, which is all straight from Oxfordshire down to Kent, whether it be regulatory alignment through the single market, allowing or encouraging significant international investment from companies like Microsoft into Reading, Volkswagen into Milton Keynes, Mars into Slough. That means just a handful of the companies that invested in hospitality. Thousands of jobs have been created around places like Heathrow, Gatwick, Dover, because through the customs union, those are our gateways for free trade to the rest of the EU. Now, they want to wipe all this away with their kind of no-deal Brexit. I think it's sensible that if we're going to leave the EU, we do so in such a way where we protect ourselves as much as possible against all of these downsides. But I also think we've reached a stage where the logjam in Parliament is such that it is now inevitable that we'll have some form of confirmatory referendum. And when we do so, I will be campaigning to remain.
Thank you very much, Giles Goodall.
Thanks, Giacomo. So my name is Giles Goodall. I'm the Liberal Democrat candidate here tonight. I wanted to tell you a bit about my background, what I believe in, why I'm standing as a European candidate. For me, the EU is above all about opportunities. And that's opportunities as EU citizens to go and study, live and work in other European countries, thanks to free movement. It's also about opportunities for our country to tackle problems together with other countries. The big problems we face in this era, and that means things like the climate emergency, terrorism, cross-border crime, geopolitical threats coming from Russia and places like that. And these are only things we can do together. My own political journey began actually here at Royal Holloway. I was a student here myself 20 odd years ago, and I became politically active here because the values which I believe in most strongly, which are international cooperation, reforming our politics, protecting the environment and building a fairer country, were best represented by the LibDems, and I joined up to the LibDems for that reason, and I still think this is the best party to represent those values. Europe is in our DNA. We were the first party back in 1948 to call for the European community and project. And that's why I'm standing here now, 20 years later, as a candidate for the European elections for the Liberal Democrats. We think that Brexit is a populist coup against our values, our national values, things like openness, cooperation, internationalism, and it's also a coup against our national interests. It's a huge own goal. And ever since the referendum, I've been, probably like you, watching angry, sad, frustrated with what Brexit has been doing to this country. It's divided the country. We're at a standstill. Parliament is in gridlock. It's turned communities against one another. It's trashed our international standing, and I worked there today in Brussels, and I see that every day. There's a mix of bemusement and pity, frankly, which people in Europe and the rest of the world feel when we look on at this huge own goal of Brexit. And meanwhile, the real issues which we face, which are, for me, inequality, the housing crisis, underfunding of the NHS and public services, the climate emergency, are all going undone and untackled because we have this huge, unnecessary distraction of Brexit, which is tying up resources, tying up Parliament and government. And frankly, we are facing a lost decade because of this. And I think also a disenfranchised generation, because many people and many of you in the room probably didn't even have a chance to vote on this in the first place, this decision that was made for you. 3 years later, since that referendum, we are basically no further. It's like Groundhog Day. We're going over and over again and making no progress. So we want to put a stop to this national psychodrama. We want to stop Brexit. And every vote for the Dems is a vote to stop Brexit. We want to do that through a people's vote. Thanks.
Thanks, Giles. So now it's Peter Wiltshire.
Good evening. My name's Peter Wiltshire. I live in Binfield, which isn't very far from here, and I'm one of the MEP candidates for the Brexit Party in the South East. I'm a businessman. I own a payment system software house that's been going for 20 years, and my clients are mostly in mainland Europe. The Brexit Party has one aim at the moment. We're using this election to send a clear message to Westminster. We'd like all MPs to deliver on the mandate from the people given to them in the 2016 referendum. I'd like to ask for a quick show of hands. Who voted or would have voted to leave the EU in the 2016 referendum? I mean, to leave. Yeah. Sorry, who would have voted not to leave? Right, I'm up against it then, aren't I? Well, to myself and the Brexit Party, this is all about democracy, and you can't have too much democracy, can you? That's the message doing the rounds at the moment. Sounds fair enough, doesn't it? The problem comes through, though, when the people saying this don't like the result of an election or a referendum. So everyone here has to look at themselves and examine their motives. I know many people here love the EU. You love what it has achieved. You won't let anything be said about its failings, its lack of democracy and transparency, because you feel there is a greater good. I don't agree with you, but I understand your point of view. However, in 2016, we had a referendum. The case for staying in the EU was made powerfully. It was laid out by Cameron, Osborne, Mark Carney, virtually all the universities and institutions in the UK, and a lot of the big businesses in this country. The government spent £9 million of our money to distribute a pro-Remain leaflet through the UK to 34 million households. Despite all these dire warnings, the Leave campaign still won. The British people voted to leave the EU. I assume the vote would be implemented. The 2016 referendum should be respected by all Democrats, no matter which side of the argument you were on. By pushing to rerun the referendum, Before leaving the EU, you are basically saying to the people of this nation, we know better. You didn't know what you were voting for. I hope you can understand the frustration of those who voted to leave when they hear these words. I've spoken to a lot of Leave voters over the last few weeks. They all feel their vote has been ignored. They feel that any one vote they make in the future just won't count. Many of them said to me they'll never vote again, and that's true. Imagine if you had voted to leave, how would you feel now? Can you understand that frustration? That frustration is why I'm standing for the Brexit Party at the European Parliament elections, 23rd of May. I'm not a politician, I'm not an expert on the EU, but I'm hugely motivated, like millions of our other people, to see democracy succeed. These elections shouldn't be happening. We should have left the EU on the 29th of March. Whatever your thoughts on the EU, the people of this country made a decision to leave. A vote for the Greens, the Liberals and the Conservatives in this election implies that you don't believe in democracy. I'm asking for you to vote for the Brexit Party at these absurd elections on the 23rd of May to send a clear message to the UK Government and Parliament. If you believe in democracy and that everyone's vote counts, no matter whether you are rich, poor, left, right, old or young, whether you have a university degree or not, if abiding by a democratic decision really matters to you, you should vote for the Brexit Party on the 23rd. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Alexandra Phillips.
Thank you. This election is about picking a side. When you go to the polls in just over 2 weeks' time, Brexit will be at the forefront of many of your minds. And as we've said, a vote for the Greens is the best way to stop Brexit. And it's a vote which says you don't need to settle for second best. Now, we know there are other Remain parties, but behind their pro-EU veneer is a very different type of politics. You don't need to settle for a party whose environment spokesperson supports fracking, or whose defence spokesperson is a cheerleader for the Iraq War. And you really don't need to settle for a party whose support of austerity, together with the Tories, sent shockwaves through this country and contributed to the Brexit backlash. You don't need to settle at all. With the Greens, you get the whole package. So, yes, of course, we will strain every sinew to stop this Brexit disaster, but we'll do so much more. We'll be in the European Parliament for the next 5 years, creating policies and politics that can transform this country and the rest of the EU. We'll fight for freedom of movement, because supporting migration and migrants is at the heart of our politics. And we will put forward the most ambitious climate plans possible, including working with colleagues from across the continent for an EU-wide Green New Deal. So, on May the 23rd, our message is clear. Voting Green is about staying in the EU, but it's also about transforming this country and this continent for the better and for generations to come. Thank you.
Thank you. Richard Robinson.
Richard Robinson, Conservative candidate for these elections. I have run businesses in a number of European countries and studied European politics at another institution. There are others. It's absolutely essential for democracy that those who lose a vote or an election accept the result of the vote. And what we're seeing today is that many of those who voted and campaigned to remain in the EU do not accept the result of that vote in 2016. They say that those who voted to leave were too old, too stupid, too racist. They say that the Leave campaign lied, overspent. They say that the margin of victory was too slight, or that the electorate has changed its mind since 2016. That's what they say, but what they mean is that they remain unreconciled to the vote that took place in June 2016. Conservatives in the European Parliament will work to deliver on the vote that happened 3 years ago. That is the first priority of any Conservative elected at this election. Now, that's the Remain. There are also Brexiteers for whom no Brexit would be pure enough. They either, like Gerard Batten, leader of UKIP at the moment, say that they would never have entered Article 50 negotiations. They would have immediately left on the 24th of June 2016, and any negotiations that happened would be sometime after that. Or there are those Brexiteers who say we should leave without a deal, without any relationship with the rest of our trading partners in Europe. We need to move forward from this. The one criticism I have of Theresa May and her ministers is that they began by saying this was easy. It's not easy. We're seeking to unpick 50 years, almost 50 years of integration with the EU. That's not easy. And we're trying to set out a course for the next 50 years of our relationship with our neighbours, our allies, and our largest single trading partner. And that's not easy. This is a difficult thing to do, and it's not surprising that it hasn't happened as speedily as people would have wanted. I understand that, perhaps not in this room, but elsewhere, people are really frustrated that we haven't yet achieved Brexit. But we will work to do so. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Richard Ashworth.
Thank you. My name is Richard Ashworth. I've been a member of the European Parliament for 15 years. I care about my country. I care about my children's future. And I'm passionate about remaining in the European Union. That's why I joined ChangeUK. And when I look at politics in the United Kingdom today, I see two major parties have deserted the middle ground, leaving millions of their supporters feeling unwarranted, unwanted, and unrepresented. I see two major parties pursuing an ideological dream of Brexit, and they've never been able to prove any economic benefit. And that's because every reputable organisation, OECD, CBI, even the government's own impact analysis has shown that there is no Brexit scenario delivers any benefit to the United Kingdom. The country will be worse off and every individual will be worse off. I see members of Parliament putting self-interest in front of the interests of their country. And I see this fantasy called Brexit damaging the health service. 50,000 vacancies today. I see it damaging investment. £800 billion worth of investment being driven offshore. And I see it damaging our children's future. But more than that, I see the country which taught the world about parliamentary democracy humiliating itself in front of the rest of the world. I know the British people are a better people than that. I believe we deserve a better politics than that. We need a new beginning. And that's why I've joined ChangeUK. We're occupying the space that the Labour Party and the Conservative Party left behind. We're passionate about remaining in the European Union. We're calling for a people's vote. And if you feel ignored and let down by the major parties, if you think politics is broken, we are there for you. ChangeUK. A new beginning, a new start, a new form of politics. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I think we'll now move to questions from the floor. Who would like to ask the first question? Yes. Could you please give your name, and this applies, by the way, to all questioners when you ask a question, please give your name and also say where you're from, if you're from Royal Holloway or perhaps from elsewhere. And at this point, I'd also like to remind the audience that if they're really keen on using Twitter, we've got a hashtag, which is hashtag RHUL debate. Yes.
My name is Ali, I'm a master's student at Royal Holloway. To the Conservative candidate, in a poll by Conservative Home today, just 22% of your own members said that they'll be voting Conservative in these upcoming elections. If you can't convince your own members to vote for you, then how's the rest of the South East going to be convinced?
The only poll that matters is the one that happens on the 23rd. Poll of some Conservative home, a unrepresentative poll, means absolutely nothing. Now, I don't pretend this is going to be an easy election. It's clearly not. We are hemorrhaging votes effectively on both sides. That's undoubtedly true. What that end result will be, I will make the case to deliver the referendum result, which is what we said we would do. I'll make that case for the next 2 weeks. After that, it's up to all of you.
Thank you. In terms of housekeeping, I'd encourage questions to individual candidates are legitimate, but in general I'd encourage people to ask questions that could apply to all 6 candidates in order to ensure fairness and balance. Yes.
Nicholas Allen, I'm an academic here at Royal Holloway. This is a question really to all the panellists. If there was a people's vote, would that actually settle the matter of Britain's membership of the European Union?
Can I answer that first?
Giles, we'll revolve around this way. So first of all, Giles Goodall.
Thanks. I think one of the main arguments for people's vote is that now, 3 years after the original referendum, we know better what the prospectus that was voted on means. It was just a very simple question about a very, very complex issue, stay or leave, and I think a lot of people on both sides didn't know what that meant. They didn't know what Brexit meant. One of the main arguments for people's vote is really to have a more informed debate, a more informed discussion, and I think we also need to think about addressing some of the shortcomings in the original vote. I would have personally said that it would be good to have some kind of threshold for the result to ensure a bit more of a consensual result. There were also certain groups who were disenfranchised in the original vote, 16, 17-year-olds, EU citizens living in the UK, some of the UK citizens living abroad more than 15 years, and I think those groups should also have a say. And then I think we need to, as I said, have an informed debate and try to come to a consensus on this. Parliament hasn't been able to do it, and the only way to do it, in my view, is indeed through a people's vote.
Okay, thanks. Peter.
You see, I find it extraordinary that we're talking about the chance, but you know, that we need a people's vote. We've had a people's vote, and I find this is why I'm sitting here. It's not about the EU. It's about democracy, and you just don't like the result, and that's just terrible. I mean, if England beat Australia playing rugby 52-48, England won, Australia lost. It's simple as that, you know. And it was a hard campaign, and there was an awful lot of talk during that campaign. I mean, as I said earlier, Cameron said WTO, we'll go to WTO rules 3 times during that campaign. It's not as though these were secrets that have come out since, and all this talk about hard Brexit and everything has come out since. We voted to leave the EU.
In terms of the people's vote, if I've understood, I think, the intention of the questioner, let's say that there were a people's vote or a second referendum, whichever way you want to call it, and let's say that were again in favour of leave. would that resolve the question? And if instead it were in favour of Remain, would that resolve the question?
Let's have best of three then, shall we? I mean, it's ridiculous. We've had a vote. It
Well,
was said this is a vote in
we're
our lifetime.
inviting
In
you
our
to kind of
lifetime.
speculate about the result of a second referendum would either be Leave or Remain. Whether it's Leave or Remain, would that solve this issue, or would it still be there sometime later? I think really that's the direction that the questioner was.
Well, okay, to answer your question, if we have another vote, I think they'll still vote to leave, and there will still be people talking about how can we overturn this vote.
Thank you. Okay. Alexandra.
To try to answer your question directly, it is obviously an advisory referendum and needs to be voted on in Parliament afterwards anyway. As we've seen, Parliament are at loggerheads over this issue. So for me, the only way out of this is to go back to the people for a people's vote. What's on that ballot paper is the question, I guess. And it cannot just simply be Remain or Leave, because there are different ways to leave. It's a bit more complex than that. You know, people voted Leave. The facts have changed. People change their minds too on both sides of the argument. And in my mind, people have a right to vote again. As Greens, we were the first party to campaign for a people's vote with Caroline Lucas MP. And we are campaigning day in and day out to make that happen. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Richard Robinson.
I think there is a principled case to be made for a second referendum, simply because the first one was a binary decision, Leave, Remain, and clearly Leave has a number of different permutations depending on what you negotiate. So I think there is a possible principled case to be made, but that's not the case that most people calling for a people's vote are making. And I thought it was quite telltale from the LibDem that they want the people's vote to have a threshold, and they want a different franchise. And I think if you try to do things like that, you really would undermine the democratic mandate that anything here gives you. There are also very real problems about what question you ask. You could say that we voted to leave in 2016, so it's how we leave should be what's on the ballot paper. Mrs May's deal or whatever, no deal, that could be the split. I'm sure that those calling for a people's vote want Remain to be on the ballot paper, so you're going to have a three-way ballot. You start to lose legitimacy the more complicated you make this. I don't think it's impossible, but I really do doubt they would ever put the issue to bed in the way that you hope. Or I took you to hope.
Thank you. Richard Ashworth.
Well, I think, looking back to the original referendum, it all seemed so clear and simple, didn't it? That it was just in or out. And those who wanted to Remain, their message was very simple. But fortunately or unfortunately, nobody dug into what out meant. And if you could talk to 6 Leavers, you get 6 different versions of what Leave meant. But we were just told, no, Leave means leave. So as time goes on, we've begun to realise everything that people were told was not actually true. We were told this is the easiest trade deal in history. We were told all the cards are in our hand. And yet actually, I think you should go and ask the car workers in Swindon or Sunderland if they think that's been the easiest trade deal in history, or if all the cards really were in our hands. Because they're not. And little by little, people are realising they were lied to. They were deceived, and they were given false expectations which could never be delivered. So here we are now, 3 years later, people realising that actually, yes, this does have an impact on their lives, an extremely serious thing. What should be happening is elected representatives in the House of Commons should be saying, look, I have to tell you what is in the best interests of this country. It is my job to ensure the defence and the prosperity of this country, and what we are proposing to do, whether for better or worse, is not in the best interests of this country. Clearly, the House of Commons is log-jammed. Clearly, therefore, the only way to unpick it is to put it back to the people, much as I would dislike doing that. but put it back to the people. And so your answer to the question, would that clarify the point or not? I don't know. My guess is they would vote to remain this time. My hope is they'd vote to remain this time, but even if they said no, knowing everything that we do now, we still intend to shoot ourselves in the foot. Little I can do about that.
Arran, what do you think?
So probably not is the short answer. I think the thing is that Europe has always evolved and changed, and at different points we've been in or out of different aspects of it, and it's progressed at different speeds for different countries. And so a debate about what our ongoing relationship with Europe is should always be part of our politics. But whether or not it becomes something that's all of our politics or just part of it, I think is a key thing. It's quite clear that the people having a general election after the Brexit referendum, so the representatives that they picked to interpret that result, are the representatives we currently have that are in this kind of logjam state. I don't necessarily think there was absolute clarity as to what Leave meant. But I do think if we were to have a second referendum, that has to be the case, and there is absolute clarity. And I think if we had an understanding of what the deal was, and that deal actually protected some of the things that for Remainers are most important about the EU, then actually the degree of resistance there would be if there was a vote that was to leave would be at least somewhat less. I still would campaign for Remain, but I think I would feel less fearful if a deal that looked very much similar to the red lines that Labour has set out into negotiations with the current government, for as long as Theresa May lasts anyway, if we had a Leave deal that looked like that, whilst it wouldn't be my preference, it would be significantly less damaging to the South East than simply going on a no-deal terms. And one kind of final point as well, sports analogies probably aren't the best, as there is always another sports match, just as there's always another general election. The point with this is it was a decision of massive scale that could only be made, if you were to believe the Brexit Party, the once. General elections are actually, in some ways, of smaller scale, but we make them every 5 years.
Thank you. Follow-up from Nick Allen.
This is just a quick point. It's worth making the point that in the second reading of the European Union Referendum Act, there was, the Liberal Democrats, Labour, the Greens, all voted for, in principle, in favour of it, on the basis that it would be a people's choice, or a people's vote at the time. I just wanted to flag that up.
But they all said before the first referendum that it was a one-off.
Exactly.
Yeah, so that was the point I was
They only wanted the second referendum when they lost the first, which is what undermines democracy, I think.
And Nigel Farage said if the result was 52-48, there should be another one.
Yep.
He said it.
He wasn't in the House of Commons,
True.
Yes. Who'd like to ask the next question? Yes.
One of the things I've found really upsetting in the last 3 years is the personalisation and the level of debate between politicians, and the fact that they tend to use very divisive language like betrayal and refer to what their parents did during the war. So I wonder if your parties have got a code of practice or code of behaviour that you're going to adhere to during this campaign to try and get away from this very divisive tone.
Peter.
We've only just got together as a party, but we're all saying it. I know there's a code as such, but we're all saying that we just don't want to be like that. We don't want to use that kind of language, and I don't think it achieves anything for anybody. And I think I think we've just got to keep to the issues, but using those kind of analogies is not helpful.
Thank you. Alexandra.
I think you're absolutely right, and I think the level, the tone of debate has deteriorated significantly over the last few years, and it's put people off politics and politicians. We have signed a code of conduct which covers that and other things. For example, if we say something in public that might not be accurate, or put something up that might not be accurate, we will then take it down as soon as possible and apologise and all those sorts of things. So we have that in place because we recognise the very point that you're making.
Thank you. Richard.
I think that the sort of debate you're talking about just undermines the argument. The real test of this is not codes of practice or whatever, but how we all behave in our everyday life. I wouldn't think that I'd done my job if I engaged in personal abuse in the way that you're describing.
Thank you.
I agree with the sentiment and the question. Incidentally, we don't have a code, but we have an understanding. We're not that kind of people because we are in the middle ground, we're moderate people. But I take the sentiment that you offer because I don't think I've ever known society in this country to be more divided than it is today. And I don't think I've ever known such bitterness within families, within communities, never mind within the House of Commons. And I think the country is in the most dreadful state. And I think it's truly heartbreaking to see it like that and to have questions made like that. We've never heard this before, have we? So we really are in a bad place. Politics really is broken. And that's why we in ChangeUK say it's time for a fresh start.
Thank you. Arran.
I also agree with the answer to the question. I mean, it needs to be remembered in the last referendum campaign, one MP ended up dead at the end of it. And I think that the stakes have been risen in politics, so much so that, for instance, I might as well say this, so for instance, all Labour candidates have been told that there's a kind of credible threat towards us that participate in these elections from the police. There is, and you know, we're not necessarily campaigning in a way where you'd expect that to be the case. I think that we've raised the stakes in this election to a point that is ridiculous, and we do need to calm it down, because there is nobody on this panel here that is a traitor. There is nobody on this panel here that is evil. There are some people that I may believe are wrong, but that is a very different thing to being any of those things. And I believe that everybody here is probably doing what they think is the right thing for this country and this nation. The point of democracy is for you to decide which one of us is right. I guess I've not signed a code of conduct. I don't feel I necessarily need to, because I wouldn't ever act in that kind of way. But I don't think there's anything that's in the Greens code of conduct that I wouldn't sign up to personally.
Just to clarify, the reason why we've done that is to try and encourage all parties to do that, so that they recognise the situation at the moment that you've highlighted.
Yes, Giles.
Yeah, I can only agree with my colleagues as well. I think some of this ugly tone and language that we've seen unleashed in the Brexit debate is one of the most depressing things about it. I think this is also something we need to try to get through with the people's vote, to do that in a different way. And after that, hopefully, my hope would be to draw a line under that episode, to try to also have a new way of working together between parties after that. I agree with Richard on that. We've talked also in the LibDems about working with like-minded parties. We do it already in Parliament on people's vote at the moment, and that's something we really want to do more of, and I think that's something we need to try to change when we hopefully put this, at one point draw a line under this and put it behind us.
Okay, thank you. Who'd like to ask a question now? The man in the green hoodie.
Can I ask you what two policies you want to get the European Parliament to adopt over the 5-year term after we stay in?
Okay, so if we stay in, which policies would you like to pursue at the European Parliament? That's assuming that Brexit is either cancelled or delayed for the long term. And perhaps, if it's not cancelled but is just delayed, and let's say hypothetically that we leave maybe in 2020 or 2021, over the next 2 years as MEPs, which policies would you like to pursue? Alexandra.
It's a great question, thank you for that. For me, the European Union provides an opportunity for us to work together and collaboratively. I would like to endeavour to work across the continent with colleagues to look at putting in a European-wide living wage. because I think that austerity and the architects of austerity in this country and across Europe have really hit people hard, and part of that is why I believe very many people did vote to leave. So I think that's really key, to have it European-wide living wage, and also a European-wide Green New Deal. And I don't know whether that means anything to anyone when I say Green New Deal, but by that I mean huge amounts of investment in renewable energies, energy efficiency, so that, for example, people have good jobs, and that their homes are warm, their bills are reduced, and there's a greater reliance, much greater reliance on renewable energies, solar panels and so forth, because we have just 10 years left to reverse the climate emergency. The Greens in the European Parliament make up one of the biggest groups, and we will have the strongest targets on those things and ambitions on those things. In the South East, you've had a Green MEP for 20 years. Because it's a proportional representation election, it means that lots of people feel in that they are able to lend us their vote and vote Green because they know that they get Green and get all of those other things in our package. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Richard Robinson.
My focus is rather more short-term than your question implied. Maybe not October, but not much longer. But there are two policies I'd like to try and influence during whatever time, should I be elected, that I have. The first is citizens' rights. I wrote and had a letter published in the Times the week after the referendum where I argued that we should ring-fence the rights of EU citizens in this country and British citizens in the EU 27. That didn't happen. I'm sorry it didn't happen, and it's led to real problems for EU citizens in this country with the settled status scheme, and I think there is room to move that forward very, very quickly, even in a short time that we remain in the EU. In fact, I came just from lunch today with one of the representatives of the 3 Million campaign group for EU citizens. I was hearing there just the technical problems that EU citizens in this country have to register. And if they're given not settled status, but the interim settled status that lasts 2 years, if they then fail to register again in 2 years' time, they will be like Windrush generation. I think this is really important that we get this right. I think we've got a duty to those people, as well as quite practically, it's important for this country that we retain many of those people who work in our health services, in our hospitals, in our hotels, building sites, whatever. So I think it's a win-win, both for us and for the European countries, and I want to work on that. Sorry, very quickly, the second policy I want to work on, for years I've campaigned to limit the transport of live animals for slaughter. There was a vote in 2012 in the European Parliament to limit the time that you could transport live animals for slaughter to 8 hours. The European Commission chose not to act on that, and I'd again like in a very short time that I have in the European Parliament to work on that.
Thank you.
I've been a member of the Budget Committee for 15 years in the European Parliament. I'm one of the people who has to draw up the priorities of where the spending goes. So I'm going to answer this by answering where the spending goes. And the spending goes to meet the legal obligations which we as a Parliament and the European Union have, but also to reconcile that with the expectations which citizens have of us. And there are 4 very clear priorities we have. The first, and spending terms by quite a long way, is jobs and growth. Actually, that involves the research, the development, the investment, the infrastructure which goes with it. But the first is creating jobs and growth, creating an economy which is globally competitive. The second is climate change. 25% of all European Union funding is now dedicated towards meeting climate change commitments, and we think that's extremely important, and we are proud of what we're achieving there. The third is border control. We have in the Schengen zone, we have no internal borders, and it's true that the external border has not been well protected and defended up until now. So border control, whether it is actually having a joined up border force, which is called Frontex, or whether it's actually meeting mass migration by addressing the cause of mass migration rather than the symptoms, rather than worrying, rather than spending our time attending to people in boats on the seas. Why don't we put resources into looking at the reasons they chose to leave home in the first instance and start to address that? So that's point number 3. And point number 4, security. I'm not necessarily talking about military, but actually we face massive threats today. Cyber security is huge. Fake news security, Russia and others, huge. Money laundering, a bigger issue than you realise. So those are the 4 very clear priorities: jobs and growth, climate change, border control and security.
Arran.
Okay, so the first thing I just want to address, as I've had the opportunity of hearing other people speak, is that the Greens group is not one of the largest groups. There is 3 groups that are larger than it, 2 of which it could in theory result in a EU Commission President being selected. The Greens are not in that running. But I'm very thankful for the fact they nearly always vote with the Socialist and Democrat group within the European Parliament. So feel free to continue to do that should you be elected. What I would say though is it's really important that if you do a vote which results in a large Social Democrat group, then we can get the presidency of the EU Commission, and the combination of having a large group of parties, and that means that things like so the kind of things that I think are most important. So workers' rights, for instance, so we've been pushing for a long time in this country. I've been campaigning for many years as a Labour candidate to fight 0 hours contracts. That looks like it's going to be impossible to do on a UK level for as long as the Tories are in power, but we can do it on an EU level, and we can continue to push for things like further evolutions of the post-working directive, so that we can make sure that we don't have situations where workers that can come here undercut workers that are already here. That's not good for them, that's not good for any of us either. I also think tax avoidance is still, despite there being massive progress on this, a big problem. So the EU held Ireland to account for its kind of sweetheart deal with Apple, and I think that's the first of many steps that need to be taken. There's still something like £5.3 trillion pounds worth of tax that's sitting around in tax havens, and we need to go even further with blacklisting those. But we also need to evolve new tax mechanisms for dealing with digital companies that cross over borders and take advantage of different tax structures that mean they can have tax advantages in one country, different tax advantages in another country, and because they only exist in a digital format, they end up paying tax almost nowhere. The Googles and the Amazons of the world. We need to be able to deal with those, and an EU level is the only way that can possibly work. One thing I will say is I do think there is a climate emergency, and I do think it's important that a continent-wide Green Deal is implemented. But one thing I would ask of the Greens is that if they, what generally happens is that the Social Democrats put forward a set of reports, and the Greens end up voting against the report that is not as precise and perfect as they would like it to be. And I understand that, but because no party has a majority in Parliament, it's always going to be the case that we have to negotiate with other people, and that will result in it being less good. Part of the problem is that the Liberals in Parliament, for instance, generally speaking, Liberals here are probably considered centre-left. I fully understand that. The Liberals in the European Parliament aren't necessarily that. They, generally speaking, manage to treat the EU as a sort of interface for lobbying big business. And that's resulted often in lots of legislation being watered down that could be better. We need a situation where if we push forward these things, our allies actually vote for them, and other people don't water down. Yeah, while we're there, we may be there for no time. We may be there for a little while, and if we're going to be there, I'm going to make the best of it.
Thank you. Since Arran has directly referred to the Greens and then slightly later also the Liberal Democrats, I'm going to give first of all Alex a chance to respond to that.
Well, I think the Labour candidate is particularly riled by us because climate change is on our turf. And whilst it's on our turf and it's really high up people's agendas at the moment, what with Extinction Rebellion, the youth climate strikes, we've had Greta Thunberg just visit our Parliament here, Westminster, just a couple of weeks ago, and David Attenborough. There's a realisation that with the European Parliament, those sorts of global issues can be dealt with at a much more effective level. We are the fourth largest group in the European Parliament, so for us, having 50 or so MEPs is obviously much bigger than having one sole MP, although I would argue that Caroline Lucas MP does much more than all of the opposition in Westminster put together. Greens have led on the key issues that people care about. Molly Scott-Cato, MEP for the South West, has led on tax avoidance. Jean Lambert, MEP, has worked for 20 years on workers' rights, and Keith Taylor, MEP, on air pollution. The Socialists follow us, and it's not the other way around. Thank you.
Thank you. So Giles, in response to the comment by Arran, but also in response to the question.
Yeah, I wanted to get back to the question to answer that one and to do it a bit more disciplined way. Our first priority has to be to stop Brexit, because otherwise we won't be able to do all these other things we would like to do. I think we are on a bit of a high coming out of the local elections last week. We saw a huge increase of votes, councillors and councils for the LibDems. Also, to give the due to the Greens, an increase there. So there was a big vote there to remain and to stop Brexit. So we see the tide changing there. In terms of in Parliament, the two huge issues which I see facing us are the climate emergency, the climate crisis, and the threat from populism, authoritarianism. Those are the two big things I think we need to tackle. We want to have a zero carbon Britain, a zero carbon Europe, and to bring forward the deadlines for those, to do that as quickly as possible. And on populism and authoritarianism, we have to tackle this head on. That means tackling all the inequalities which are behind these issues, which feed the issues, also protecting our fundamental rights, our fundamental values, rule of law in the European Union from those threats. And it's not just the populist insurgency that came with Brexit here in the UK, it's happening elsewhere in Europe, in Poland, Hungary and Italy and so on. And we need to work together with pro-European groups, and I would say we have also the third biggest group, Liberal group in the Parliament, but we are absolutely for working with the other pro-European groups in Parliament to make sure those things happen.
Okay, thank you. So, Peter Wiltshire, which two policy areas would you pursue as an MEP?
You said that with a slight smile on your face, I noticed. The Brexit Party is in these elections. We believe these elections shouldn't be happening. We're here to say that it's a protest vote. As far as policies, our policy is to get out of Europe. It's pretty simple. We've had a democratic referendum. When you say our first priority is to stop Brexit, it just makes me shiver. It's to stop the will of the people. It's just staggering the things that you're saying, that you believe that's a sort of a reasonable thing to say. We've had a referendum and the people voted to leave the EU. It's just staggering that people say that so easily. It runs off your tongue, as if to say my first priority in Istanbul is to overturn the will of the people in the election for the mayor of Istanbul. It's the same thing. You cannot talk like that. This is democracy in action, everybody. Sorry, I'm going off piece, sorry.
I suppose the question, perhaps in the case of an MEP from the Brexit Party, is that, granted Brexit in a sense is a policy, and it's clear that you would campaign on that, you wouldn't necessarily have a choice of the agenda, because...
As a group, we'll get together with other like-minded groups that have been elected during this process, because there will be others, and try and work out from within, and also talking to the UK Parliament as a group, to say, deliver the will of the people.
Well, that's granted. In a sense, if policy issues come up on day-to-day policy, like should there be more or less regulation of chemicals in agriculture, the type of technical vote that the Parliament votes on many, many times, would you take part in those votes?
I can't see us adding to any of the huge number of laws and things that come out of the EU. I just can't see that happening. We'll be there because we don't want to be there, and we have to be clear about that. We're not going to smudge this. We don't want to be there.
Giles wants to...
Can I just come back, because Peter mentioned something I'd said. Nigel Farage has been in the European Parliament drawing his salary from the EU for 20 years, and he's achieved nothing there at all.
I think
he sits on the Fisheries Committee. He doesn't go to the meetings. He complains about EU fishing policy. He doesn't do anything. The UKIP MEPs who've been there have been a waste of space, quite frankly, and done nothing for their country at all.
They're doing a lot for their country because they created the situation where we can actually have a chance to leave the EU.
Okay, it's time for another question. Yes, Ava.
I'm Eva, I'm Spanish, but I study here at Holloway. And many of you are talking about a possible second referendum, which you wish, ends up being Remain, which I do wish to as a fellow European. But if we were to respect the results of the 2016 referendum, which obviously with 52-48 did not call for a hard Brexit, which we could possibly see at the moment, what would you and your party do to try and get the best possible outcome for Britain and the EU, potentially?
So, in a sense, we're asking, to assume that leaving is actually going to happen, and if leaving is actually going to happen,
referendum which doesn't,
either the second
which still goes leave.
What could you and
your party do to get the best possible outcome for Britain?
Okay, so if leaving one way or the other is unavoidable, how would you get the best outcome for the UK?
And Europe, she's very...
And Europe. And Europe. Yeah. Richard.
Well, we're the one party who are in the process of trying to do this, and there is a withdrawal agreement, there is a political declaration, there is evidence of what a Conservative Brexit would look like. I don't know that I can give you very much more than that. Like almost everybody in politics, I have specific things that I would want to see in that Brexit agreement that are not there, and there are things in there that I would want out. But that's the deal on the table at the moment. The European Commission have said that they will not reopen the Brexit agreement. So if we're to leave, it looks at the moment like it's that or nothing. And I think nothing is a unfathomable way to go. So the deals that are on the table are the Conservative policies. I can be clear on that.
I think if I can paraphrase your question, is what is the least worst option?
Yeah.
Would that
what
be...
would you do to make it least
Yeah.
worst?
And if you actually said, what would I settle for if we were to... Well, I wouldn't. Because there isn't anything anywhere near as good as the arrangement we have right now. So let me just make that absolutely clear. And that's been proven, again, even by the government's impact assessment. Everybody, the countries standing in the world and individuals standing, would be damaged by it. And I suppose if I'm looking at the least worst, we hear people saying, well, why can't we be like Norway? Why can't we be like Canada, for example? Well, here's the problem. The minute you leave the European Union, but more to the point, the minute you leave the customs union, because that's what Mrs. May's red line said, you become a third country. And whether you want to be like Norway or like Canada, the one thing they've all got in common is they've got borders. And the borders aren't there just for fun. They're there for a very positive, very firm reason. They're to protect the consumers on the other side of the border. So it's an external border of the European Union as much as Britain's border. So if you've got borders, you do have an interruption of trade. You have what they term friction these days. And at the border they are looking for had tariffs being paid, and clearly the more you negotiate your trade deals around the world, the more you differentiate yourself from the single market, so therefore financially there has to be a border. But it's more about the regulations, that actually if you want to actually be like Canada or Norway, you want to do away with the regulations of the European Union, which I remind you are there for a very good reason. You want to import textiles into Europe, you know that if they're imported, they're not using child labour. If you want to import beef into Europe, you know it's not been injected with hormones. If you want to buy agricultural goods. You know it's not being grown on land which was cleared out of rainforest. That's why those borders are there. Now, I don't believe anybody in this country knowingly voted to reduce the standards which we have. I know a lot of them were conned into doing so by the Leave campaign, saying get away with European rules, but they didn't stop and say, well, what are those rules there for? They're actually to make sure you don't use child labour, use hormone-treated beef. That's what they do, but you want to do away with that. That's fine. Well, if you're that third country, there will be a border. There will be a border in Northern Ireland. There will be a border at Dover and anywhere else. That damages trade. If you don't believe me, listen to the CBI, listen to Nissan, listen to Honda, see what they've got to say about it. So we will damage ourselves. And not only that, but when I'm talking about those regulations, which if you wish to still trade with the customs union, Mrs. May said you're out of it, but she's trying to describe a situation where you're in it but you're not. What it actually means is the European Union, the other 27, make up the rules, and you, Britain, will abide by them. Otherwise you're not in, or anywhere near in the customs union. That makes you a rule taker. Now, does a country like ours really want to sit here and take rules? I don't believe it. I simply don't believe it. So is there a least worst option? No, there's nothing nearly like as good as we've got right now, and it's crazy to even think about it.
Thank you for that clear answer. Arran.
So, I agree that staying in the EU is a better deal than being out of the EU and any deal that could be built. But I think it's realistic and reasonable, given that the referendum was lost, to plan for what that would look like, on the basis that a route to a second referendum is whilst I think probably at this point inevitable, has not for up until this point been inevitable, and it is still, we still have a long way to go to be there. And I think that if we were to do that, and customs union is clearly a key part of it, it is a lot about trade. I'm a Labour person, you would expect me to be a member of a trade union. I think the big point of being a trade union is you stand with your colleagues, and by doing so you can negotiate a better price for your labour out of your employer and better conditions. And the point of the customs union is that when we do big international trade deals with other big entities like America, we can do that using the customs union as a method to do so. If we're outside of that, whilst we are a big country and a strong country, and there is lots of people that would want to do a deal with us, there's lots of people that are much bigger than us, and lots of other people that are smaller than us that are joining unions very similar to the EU, including most of the African nations currently. They'll be able to negotiate in a way that is difficult for us to contend with. So we should be in the customs union so that we can benefit from both trade, and also, much of this audience is probably too young to remember the kind of troubles with Northern Ireland, but if we set a hard border through the island of Ireland, then that peace process will start to unravel very quickly. Large portions of the text of the Good Friday Agreement are predicated on the basis that there is no border there and that we're a member of the EU. So it's going to be very difficult very quickly there as well. I think when it comes to regulatory alignment, I don't necessarily think we fully need to be in the single market, but we do need to have a very close relationship with it. If we don't want to have a sort of race to the bottom on workers' rights and consumer protections, then we will need to be integrated very closely with the single market. If we don't want to be a rule taker, then we probably can be in a situation where we opt in and out. But to be honest, we do that currently with all sorts of bits of the single market. So those would be my red lines: customs union, regulatory alignment, particularly on workers' rights and consumer protections. And strangely enough, those are the red lines that Jeremy Corbyn is negotiating with Theresa May right now. My understanding is it's not going well. But I would like to point out there isn't just one party that is trying to find a way through this in Parliament. There is every party that's in Parliament, but in particular right now the Labour Party as well. It's not going well, though, is it? So we can kind of see there is only one route forward.
Yes, just to clarify, I mean, this is a valid point concerning the border of Northern Ireland. Norway was mentioned previously. Norway is in the single market, it's not in the customs union. And what that means is that although Norway is in the single market, and although people can cross the border between Norway and Sweden without immigration checks, there is a customs border to check for goods. And one of the problems in Northern Ireland is that the demand there would be that the border is a border that is without identity checks, so without immigration checks, but also without customs checks, without checks on what people are carrying. And it's certainly the case that Northern Ireland then would need to be in a customs union with the rest of Ireland in order to avoid those types of border checks.
But the borders would be put in by the EU, not by the British Parliament. That's what you're implying. Norway, family on both sides of the border in Ireland, and it won't. You're saying it's going to result in violence. Means you're just making another example, another argument to say you can't leave the EU. It's absolutely.
I'm saying you can't leave the EU without staying in customs union or finding.
Anyway, can I just answer that last question actually?
It's Giles' turn.
I'm obviously not.
Thanks. I think one of the most interesting impacts beyond Britain of the Brexit process has been that support for EU membership in every other EU member state has gone up. That's because we've kind of inoculated the rest of Europe against this shit show, as conservative politicians call it, and the German Chancellor. And they've seen what it means, and this goes to show that the best solution is not a Tory Brexit, not a Labour Brexit, not a Labour-Tory stitch-up Brexit, not a Labour bailing out the Tories Brexit, but the deal we currently have. It's the only deal, it's the best deal, and we have to try and keep it.
Okay. And Peter?
If you don't really believe in leaving the EU, you don't go into the negotiation in the right way. And the Conservative government have just made a complete balls up of it from the start, really. I mean, I negotiate deals all the time, and taking no deal off the table, which is what all the parties did, doesn't create a situation where you're going to get a good deal from the EU. It really doesn't. I mean, if we'd gone into the negotiations and said, look, we'd love to get a deal, but on the 29th of March we're leaving on WTO terms, we might have got a reasonable way out of the EU. But the way out at the moment is not a way out. It's a treaty. It's worse than staying in the EU. At least you can leave the EU. It's just, this is all smoke and mirrors. The EU don't want to make it easy for anyone to leave, but for a government and a parliament that doesn't want to leave anyway, just to pretend and go through the motions of making the people feel that they're trying to leave. That's what it comes down to, really. No one is trying to make it. We don't want it to be difficult to leave. We want a good relationship with Europe. I'm not trying to be insular. I'm a world person. My wife's from New Zealand. New Zealand does fine outside of the EU. It's on its own, and it's not in a big trading bloc. Sorry, what I mean is it's fine not being in a big trading situation like the EU. It's fine.
Geography surely does matter. So Australia trades much more with China than we do, because it's much nearer to China.
Can I finish my point, though?
Yeah.
My point is, I want a good relationship with Europe. My biggest clients are in Germany. I've got no problem with trading, and I think if we go into these negotiations with that kind of attitude, that we don't want to close any doors, we want to keep doors open. We want students to come from Europe. We don't want to stop anything like that. It happened before the EU. Students came to the UK before the EU. They're coming from all over the world into this country. It's not the EU that did it. But the most important thing is we've had these arguments before, and there was a referendum. And unfortunately, you lost the referendum. I mean, people face up to it.
I think there are some other panellists who want to make some quick points, and I was going to invite actually Richard Robertson, because Peter has made a point which is a legitimate argument, not unanimously accepted, that the government and the current Parliament in Westminster don't want Brexit, and that many of them are Remainers trying to...
Two-thirds.
Two-thirds perhaps, are Remainers who are trying to block that. Richard Robinson, what would you say is the view of the Conservative Party very succinctly on this issue? I think you've really alluded to it already.
Well, in terms of blocking Brexit, I don't think the Conservative Party looks at all like trying to block Brexit, as much as many of you might want them to. It's quite clear that the minority of the Conservative Party, and a very small minority of the Conservative Party in Parliament, are against Brexit, or at least against delivering on the referendum result, which is somewhat different. I really don't think anybody in Parliament is trying to block a deal here. There are very few no-deal votes in the current Parliament. But the fact is that in 2017, Mrs May, I think quite rightly, said that the way to get a negotiation with the EU was to give her a large majority. She didn't get it. The fact is that the divisions in Parliament almost exactly reflect the divisions in the country. Pretty nearly 50-50. And that's why we're deadlocked.
Perhaps it would have been a good time for Mrs May to stop and listen to the people who didn't agree with what she'd said. But in any case, the other point that I just wanted to come in to say, I hear the narrative coming particularly from the Leave campaign about the EU giving us a deal, the EU tough negotiations on us. Look, you chose to leave. You drew up the red lines. You said no court of justice, no customs union, no single market. And whether you like it or not, that's boxed you and the EU into a tiny little corner with very few options on the table. That's why you're in the situation you are, encouraging people to think, oh, there's some sort of magic deal there which will actually, maybe they'll be nice to us, they can do this or that. Well, they can't. They can't. And that's why they've consistently said the withdrawal agreement, which is on the table, rationally, logically, is the only possible agreement that there could be. It's not as if there's sort of negotiating around the edges. And I return to the point that really at the end of the day it comes down to customs union. Either you're in it or you're out of it. Mrs May, right at the beginning, said we're out of it. That was a red line. And ever since, I suspect she's realised the folly of those ways. I suspect at that time she had no idea of the complications and complexity of what actually saying that's our red line meant. And she's clearly, all the British people are regretting it ever since.
Alex.
It's quite an interesting question. I've always been opposed to Brexit, and let me tell you why. There's a huge amount of suffering, even in the southeast, which is seen as, you know, a wealthy part of the country, and people are reliant on food banks. These sorts of situations are only going to worsen with Brexit. I also think it's deeply irresponsible, whatever side of the argument that you're on, for this to go ahead at this moment. It will plunge the country into chaos. The pound will drop, inflation will increase, and it will be detrimental to our economy. Freedom of movement is our greatest gift. The peace project that Europe was based on, is the greatest thing that, you know, we've done as being part of Europe. And, you know, trade is extremely important, especially for the southeast because of where we're based. If you look at Canada, for example, it took them well over a decade to sort out some of their trade agreements. And at the moment, I believe the only trade agreement that we have in place is with Switzerland. So we might have a lot of cuckoo clocks and Toblerone, but these things are going to take an awful long time, and we should just get on with stopping Brexit and bringing some much needed stability to our country and the continent.
Thank you. So another question. Yes. Please, can you give us your name and where you're from?
Chelsea. I live just around the corner. I'd first like to fact check the Green candidate. You said you're part of the 4th largest group. You're actually part of the 6th largest group. Yeah, you are. The Liberals are actually in the 4th largest group. And while we're on that note, I'd like to ask what groups you're all part of in the European Parliament and what you believe those groups stand for. Because I believe ChangeUK have joined the EPP, which is a Conservative group. And if you're the Conservative group, why don't you just stay in the Tories?
So to sum up, then the question. No, it's a valid question. It is which group would you be in? And we've already talked a little bit about policies and which policy agendas you pursue. Perhaps we could put as an add-on there a kind of question from me, which is which two committees would you choose to join if you were elected to the Parliament? And besides, which group would you be in? Richard Ashworth.
You were right in saying that I, as a sitting member, currently sit in the EPP. You're right in saying it's a centre-right group, it's a pro-business, pragmatic group of people. But you're not right to say that ChangeUK is aligned or in any way associated at this stage with the EPP or indeed with any other group, nor would it be wise to do so. What you actually do is you have your election, you get your candidates, then you arrive in Brussels, and then all the groups are drawn together and you make your alliances and allegiances there. It's not at present for me to determine who we would align ourselves with, but it will be one of the centre ground, pro-Europe, pro-business, pragmatic groups.
And committees, I suppose, you mentioned the Budget Committee. Would you be planning to perhaps serve on another one besides the Budget Committee?
Well, I do now. I serve on the Agriculture Committee as well. But I've had 15 years on the Budget Committee. It's not for me to determine at this stage whether I would continue to do so or not. First, we've got to get elected. Secondly, you've got to get to Europe and then allocate those places. So, far too early to say.
Thank you. Arran, Neathey.
So, the question of which group I'm going to be is fairly obvious. Being the Social and Democrat group, there's no question about that, and I should be staying there for the duration of the time I'm in Parliament as well. In terms of the committees, I've just had to go through this process in local government about how you get appointed to a committee. So I wouldn't like to prejudge where I'm likely to end up, because it's not necessarily going to be definitely where I want to be. But I'm also aware that I'm obviously not an MEP yet. And so every single kind of computation of different committees, I'm not exactly sure what the different titles are, but I would seek to work on committees that deal with tax avoidance and workers' rights.
Okay. Employment and economics. Then.
Thank you.
Giles
Goodall.
Yes. You mentioned, I think already, ALDE, the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats group. So this is the group which the LibDems are part of. This is the one I would be part of. It's an influential group because it's often the swing vote between left and right. It's a pro-European centre group. It's forecast to grow and to gain more seats across Europe at these elections. So it's forecast to be even more influential. It currently has actually 6, I think, prime ministers, Liberal prime ministers around Europe as well. So this is also the way to get things done with allies, with networks around Europe. And as I said, we are very much open to working with all the pro-European groups. That means the Greens, some of the other centre groups. There's a question about La République En Marche, Emmanuel Macron's party, which group they will join. They've already been in negotiations with the Liberals. That may happen. We have to see a bit also what happens with the populist parties and where they end up. But this next parliament will be about the pro-European parties working together against the populists and the nationalists to get things done. Just on the committees, I mentioned already my priorities: environment and attacking populism. The LibDem committee, civil liberties, deals with discrimination issues, with inequality, with home affairs and so on. This is a very important one I'd be interested in. And then also the environment committee, of course, for climate issues.
Thank you. Peter Wiltshire.
Just the escape committee.
Come back on a fact-checking point. The Greens are in fact the 4th largest group behind the ECR.
Question: Do
Yes.
you sit with the GUE group or the Greens?
So I was just going to clarify that because I worked in Brussels for Caroline Lucas a long time ago, and so I was just thinking, but we are the 4th largest group. Oh no, I think you've got me mixed up with GUE, who are the 6th, I think.
No,
yeah.
GUE is the 4th largest. The Greens are the 6th.
Well,
Currently, They understand.
So I will be sitting with the Greens EFA group, which has, I think, around 50 MEPs. In terms of, thank you, I can't keep all of the facts, in my head, but thank you. The different, as other people have said, I've been a local councillor for 10 years, so I understand that you don't always get the committees that you want. In the European Parliament, if we're only there until the end of October, I'm not sure how my colleagues are going to view me if I want, some of the really good committees, like the Environment Committee or the Transport Committee, for example. But I do think that as a woman, the European Parliament has a really strong role in our rights, maternity rights, workers' rights, those sorts of things, trying to eradicate the glass ceiling. The FAM committee, which is, which looks at a large part of that work, I would love to sit on, and the Environment Committee or the Transport Committee, because transport is so key for us to reduce our carbon emissions. I'm a cyclist, and my husband owns a bus company which is migrating all of its vehicles onto 100% electric buses. I think it's the first bus company to have 100% electric buses in England. And so those sorts of things really interest me, because I understand that we need to make a radical shift now if we're to be a zero carbon continent by 2030. But what I would say is that in terms of our positioning in the European Parliament, we just had the local elections last week. Our vote share increased by something like 250% across the country. We have got a lot of momentum behind us, and it's forecast to increase further. What I want to be for you is your advocate in the European Parliament and across the South East, and I can assure you that I will put blood, sweat and tears into that and work far across my brief. Thank you.
Thank you. Things moved on quite fast, but I noticed that at the end of his intervention, Peter Wiltshire said that he'd be a member of the Escape Committee. I think probably the committee that's most in line with that objective would be the Constitutional Affairs Committee, which is the committee that draws up the report on the Article 50 agreement. Richard Robinson.
Conservative SIB with the European Conservatives and Reformists in the European Parliament. It's a group that is against further integration of the EU, sees the EU very much as an organisation of nation states. In terms of which committee, as a new boy you go where you're sent, but if I had a choice it would be the Budget Committee. It's where the money is and you follow the money. It's where decisions get taken. That's offensive.
Would you be interested in any other policy area besides the budget?
Absolutely. I mean, constitutional affairs clearly deals with Brexit, and I think that getting this over the line is probably our first priority as Conservatives if we're elected.
Yes. Thank you very much. I can't remember if we started with you. I'm sorry. Yes, we did.
I'll tell you again if you like.
No. I'm terribly sorry.
You didn't know who was going to sit with us.
We're now just past 7:30. We could continue for a short while more, and I see that there are a number of hands up. Jordan Montgomery.
I'm Jordan Montgomery. I'm a student here at Royal Holloway. I just wanted to ask, could each of you explain why a student should vote for your party in these upcoming elections?
So why should a student vote for your party in these upcoming elections? Arran Neathey.
Well, as I said several questions ago, the composition of the Parliament will have a large say on who ends up being the President of the EU Commission. And if we want to have a Europe that's focusing on things like workers' rights and youth unemployment and developing the economy, all of which things that, as I sort of said in my opening statement, are things that if that kind of gets, bluntly, fucked up in this country, then as a student you will suffer significantly when you enter into the workforce. I don't want any of you to have to go through what I went through. And I think the best way we can do that is make sure we protect the economy, but also the EU, for as long as we're in it, making sure it focuses on things that will enable you to succeed when you go into the workforce. And that's why you should vote for us.
Okay, thank you. Giles?
Yeah, I said it also in my opening statement. I think it's really about opportunities. This is what the EU offers us. And I did some of those things myself. I was an Erasmus student. I've been a free mover as well, living abroad. These, I think, are great opportunities for young people studying and working abroad, having that enriching experience of living in another culture, more employment opportunities, learning other languages, and all these great things that free movement brings us. Then we also have things like the Youth Guarantee, the European Social Fund, which also help to provide opportunities, training, jobs for young people as well. And so these are really the crucial things. And I think, coming back to my original point, remaining in the EU, having access to all these things is what we really want to guarantee.
Thank you, Giles. Peter?
I think I'm going to hark back to the democracy angle, because the Brexit Party is trying to... I suppose start again. You've got to look at this country as a place of fair play, and democracy underpins everything. We can talk about all sorts of different issues, but democracy is absolutely fundamental.
There's no democracy in the Brexit Party. It's a one-man Führer leads it. You've no delegates, it's a totally undemocratic party.
Can I just carry on, please? Yeah. If you want to talk to me afterwards, you're very welcome, but I'm sorry. Democracy is important. We had a vote in 2016. The Leave side won that vote, and it's undeniable. You can't deny that. You can't suddenly move on from it. And I think if you want this country to live up to that decision and to move forward with a really solid base, you've got to vote for the Brexit Party. This is our only opportunity at the moment to say to the people that voted to leave, please come out again. It's important. Democracy is important.
The Brexit Party has built itself on the legitimate argument that it is defending the democratic decision of the British people. Others might have a different view of democracy, and there are many different views of democracy, but that is one view of democracy, and you've just explained why people in general should vote for the Brexit Party. But the question I was asking about students, why would students specifically wish to vote for the Brexit Party?
The student, if you love this country and you want to feel that this country is going in the right direction, you have to honour that result. I think it's absolutely imperative that we think that something as big as that, one of the biggest decisions we've ever made, one of the biggest democratic decisions that we've ever made, and we have to live up to it. It's just extraordinary that we're thinking about rerunning it because it didn't match what everybody here wanted. It shouldn't work like that. It shouldn't work like that. If you come back to the point in 10 or 15 years' time and say we shouldn't have left, I get that because you've had time, but we should leave. It's important that we leave because the decision was made.
Thank you. Alexandra.
Thanks. Well, I joined the Green Party when I was a student. I left the Labour Party in 2003 because of, they were going to war in Iraq. And I joined the Green Party at the time not for sort of environmental issues, but very much for human rights and social justice issues. And I think, when I think back to my time as a student, and indeed here today, this event I believe is sponsored by Erasmus. So obviously, even it's not just about an exchange, they also support events such as this. But I moved to Paris when I was 18 and lived there and worked there and loved there and everything for 4 years. And then I went on to Brussels and worked for Caroline Lucas in the European Parliament. Since then, I've contributed to our economy as a teacher, as a languages secondary school teacher. and brought with me, you know, all that knowledge that I've learned around a different culture, a different way of life, and try and enthuse young people about all of those things and encourage them to learn languages. I have an 18-month-old son and I speak to him just in French because I see the value of learning languages and making that exchange with people. But, you know, poverty and inequality are huge issues for young people. We are the only party to have opposed tuition fees. You know, in 2013, I found out that in the South East region, over 400 jobs were created by the European Parliament, and there was an investment of over £14 million in the region that year alone. But climate change, even though that wasn't the reason why I joined the Greens, really, it was to do with social justice and human rights, it's the biggest issue of our time. And it's your generation and my son's generation who are going to be straddled with the impact of that. And what that means here is that we will have scorching summers and floods. What that means across the global south is that people will endure droughts and starvation. This is the biggest deal right now. So a vote for the Green Party in these elections will help your future and all those young people who are together who are going to have to deal with this in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard.
I don't think the things that affect you as a student are really any different from the things that affect everybody else. Just perhaps more so because you're going to be around for rather longer than I am. As I said at the beginning, keeping this just to the European issue, we are building a new relationship probably for the next 40 or 50 years with our European partners. Getting that right will matter to you much, much more than it matters to me in retirement. If we're going to deliver on the Brexit referendum, doing it in a way which protects jobs and protects your future and protects the green agenda, I think is as important to you as it is to me, but probably more so to you simply because you're going to be there for much, much longer.
Thank you.
Membership of the European Union internal market means freedom of movement of goods, services, capital and people. And so, does that matter to you as a student? You bet your life it does. The reason is it gives you the opportunity to study, to work, to travel, to live, to exchange culture throughout Europe. And let me just illustrate some of those. Erasmus. The opportunity for student exchange, the opportunity for student funding has been phenomenal, and the uptake in the United Kingdom has been really, really impressive. Research funding. The opportunity for postgraduate research, the opportunity to operate in commercial research, huge. Cultural exchange, enormous. And actually, let me just give you one bit of anecdotal evidence also. The European Parliament funds free Interrail tickets for students under, I think, the age of 18 to travel wherever they like in Europe. And we have just received the highest level of bookings from students from the United Kingdom ever. I think that's fantastic. I mean, students taking up the opportunity, free, benefit of the European Union, to travel where they like by train, visit and learn about Europe. That's wonderful. So, yes, membership of the European Union brings opportunity for students, but of course, to do that, you've got to remain. So to do that, you've got to vote for a party which is favouring Remain, which of course, as I said earlier, we in ChangeUK, we're on your side.
Thank you very much. It's now 7:42. We have to be out of this room by 8, so I can take one last question so long as it's a quick one and we get a quick round of answers from the panelists. Yes, you at the back, near the back. Yes, yes, you. Sorry, you're wearing a stripy shirt. So.
So I'm Anna Maria, and I'm from Estonia, but I study in Royal Holloway. And my question would be mainly for the parties that are campaigning to remain. I am, of course, as a European, I am not pro-Brexit. But the thing is, what would these parties do if the Leave vote does go through and Britain leaves Europe? What is their policy then?
Right. Okay. So the questionnaire is Estonian. It comes from Estonia and has a concern about the policy or the retention of rights post-Brexit. Do we want to have a quick round of answers to that one? We'll start
It's
with.
very similar to the other
No, it's very similar to the other question. But it might be perhaps worth reiterating very quickly what the policy is that you would want to pursue if indeed we do leave. And I know that some of the panellists have said that under no circumstance could they countenance leaving anyway. Giles.
Well, yeah, I said it before, the best option is the one we have, and that's absolutely our priority, to stop Brexit and to remain through people's vote. I think the next best option is to have the closest possible relationship, but it will always be worse. There will always be things that we don't have, that we lack, and personally I would be on day one campaigning to come back as well.
I think the question was specifically, if I recall, about citizens' rights. Well,
No, it's mainly about if Britain is already out.
yeah. But the rights of residency if Britain is out. Yes. So the rights of residency if Britain. Do you want to just add something?
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to guarantee all the rights that exist for EU citizens at the moment, keep them. I would be fighting to maintain them as well for future EU citizens that come here. And I think that's crucial. I think that also means voting rights, for example, as part of our manifesto as well, so that EU citizens here should have the right to vote also in general elections, not just local European elections. And this is, and referendums, yeah, this is crucial.
Okay, so from Giles Goodall, it's a full set of rights, including for people who've not yet arrived in the UK, as well as to preserve the rights for those who are here, and including voting rights and extending those voting rights. Peter Wiltshire.
As far as I'm concerned, well, Brexit Party is concerned, we've got no issue with people studying in the UK and get, people come from all over the world. It's not a problem to come here to study and get a permit to study. So there's plenty of future coming here. We're an open country and we will stay an open country. This is not a...
The question was about rights. Should they have those rights? Should pre-existing residents have their rights absolutely protected?
Pre-existing, absolutely.
And reciprocally for Brits in the rest of the European Union.
Yes,
so,
absolutely. Pre-existing, absolutely.
Alexandra.
I think, for example, you're more likely to be treated by a migrant doctor or nurse here in the NHS than you are to be in the queue behind one in front of you. Our country has a long established history of accepting people into this country, and it's a two-way street. We go elsewhere, like I said earlier. Migration is a good thing. We have an awfully hostile environment here in this country, and my heart goes out to those people who are not British, because I know that there's been a huge rise in xenophobia and hatred. The Greens won't shy away from defending people's rights. We believe that you should have the same rights that you have now. They should be extended. More people coming here, they should have the same rights that currently exist. We've just seen today how many people in the news, how many Europeans have left over the last year, and it's not good for our economy, it's not good for our society. We're unable to enrich our lives. You being here strengthens our communities, and it strengthens our economy, and it boosts our public services. It is a huge benefit. What I would like to see going forward is a much fairer system of immigration, which treats people with dignity, which you may or may not have experienced depending on where you've come from. But I know from casework that I've received as a local representative that it is just appalling how people are treated, and it's completely inhuman.
Thank you.
Nick Richard? My first priority would always be those European citizens who have made their home in this country up until now. And I would be urging any government of any colour to change the registration system which we have for European citizens, the settled status system, to the application system, which is what it is, to a registration system. At the moment you have to apply to stay, and if you are not accepted on application, you're effectively asked to leave. I think it should be a very simple registration system where you turn up at the post office or your local authority with your passport and say, I am resident here, with some proof that you were resident here before the Brexit date, if this happens after the Brexit date, and you're registered. It shouldn't need more than that. You shouldn't have to apply to stay in your own home if you're a European citizen in this country.
Yes, so it could be done with just council tax records. So that's assuming that people are registered for council tax, or for whatever other metric you use.
One of the problems that was being discussed today, I had this meeting, as I said, with the 3 million, is there are an enormous number of people in East Anglia who are undocumented. They literally live in trailer parks, they work cash in hand, and they have effectively no rights under the current system. And it would be very difficult for them to establish rights under any future system. And I think we need to look at that. I think we need to make this as easy as possible for those who are already here. What on earth have we got to lose, either morally or practically, by doing that? If somebody comes from Romania today and says, oh, I was here, I want to register, well, that's another person who could have come in the next 6 months had we remained in the EU anyway. I really don't see that we should make this any more difficult than it has to be.
Thank you.
Citizens' rights was one of the first elements of the agreement between the two parties. If you remember, citizens' rights, financial settlement and Northern Ireland border were the three key issues originally. Now, the document drawn up between both parties divides citizens' rights into 4 categories, and I'll take you through them all. The first one I'll take first is general visitors and travel. There, the proposal from the EU 27 countries is there will be what is termed a 90-180 day rule, that in any 180 days you can spend 90 days visiting visa-free. Okay, so if you then, after that period, you'd have to return to the United Kingdom, and you wouldn't be able to return visa-free until the termination of that period, but you would, in any 180 days, be able to travel visa-free in Europe. Second one is the question of residency. There are 1.5 million British people living in Europe, and there are 3 million Europeans living in this country. For all those people who live here now and who propose to live here before the date of exit from the European Union, they will be allowed to do so provided they register in the nation that they're seeking to dwell. That, I understand, currently is fairly shambolic from the UK perspective, and it's also, I hear some very distressing stories that, you know, you have to do it online. And a lot of these people are in their latter years, and they're just not IT literate. They can't do it. It's not as easy as that. The other confusion which I have a big mailbag from British people who live in Europe. Why can't I retain my EU citizenship? And again, I have to explain to them all that because there's no such thing as an EU citizenship. There are currently 28 nations who choose to, by treaty, live together, work together, and therefore respect freedom of movement of goods, services, capital, and people. So that gives them the right to move. But if you take yourself out of that treaty, you are therefore no longer entitled to that right of free movement. You would, in theory, only be entitled to any bilateral agreement made between the United Kingdom government and the 27 other member state governments. And some of those discussions are in fairly advanced state. For example, it would be unthinkable that a country like Spain would want to make it difficult for so many British people living in that country, whereas other countries either have not made any progress or are saying, well, actually, if Spain want to relax those rules as a bilateral between the UK and Spain, what if we don't? So therefore, of somebody, an English person living in Spain, who then decides, but actually I've got a son in Italy, or I want to go work over the border somewhere, what happens then? Do they get the same rights? Well, at present the answer is no, they don't, unless something is further resolved. The third point is the question of workers' rights, and the proposition from the United Kingdom is that migrant workers will be allowed into the United Kingdom provided they earned over £30,000 a year. No, it's my own view, but that is crazy. It's completely crazy. Because it's those people earning under £30,000 a year who are picking the fruit and packing the vegetables. It's the people who are sweeping the corridors in hospitals. It's the people who are running the hospitality and food industry in this country. It's nurses. It's nurses, yeah. It's a whole range of them. Well, the floors. Well, it's your party of saying under 30,000 they can't come. So, I'm not defending it, Richard, really. Well, that is clearly crazy, and you can't go forwards with that. Actually, just...
We'll have to wind up in a moment.
Okay, well, just very quickly, anecdotally, in other European countries, workers, if you're there after three months without a job, you can be required to leave. In Britain, you can't. Why? Because you haven't got ID cards, so you don't know who anybody is. And the last point, sorry, because the question which you wanted was for students. There is an agreement that students, yes, they would be able to remain for the duration of their studies. And that's the problem, because so many of them, therefore, when is the end of your studies and what comes after that? Sorry.
In response to that question, we had the most. Oh, sorry, Arran. Yes, Arran Neathey.
First thing I'd like to say to anyone that's here that isn't British, whether it be from the EU or elsewhere, is thank you for being here. I think you fundamentally make our country a better place. I don't think that matters whether you're a nurse or a doctor or whether you're just a student or anything, really. I think fundamentally it makes our country better. And I think the kind of hostile form of immigration policy that we've had for a very long time is not good, and we need to unwind it for everybody. And if we are to leave the EU, then I would hope that if you want to stay, you can stay for as long as you wish to, and you should have no less rights than anyone that was born here should. And in fact, I appreciate that that's not even the case currently, so there's a lot of work to be done with that yet. And that was basically where I think we should arrive at. I think if we arrive at a place where there's any of the kind of softer Brexit deals, then it's a high likelihood that we'll have some form of freedom of movement maintained anyway. But that's it. And I'm not going to go on for ages, if that's okay.
Thank you. In response to that question, I know that Giles was the first to respond and offered a very liberal, he's a Liberal Democrat, very liberal response of absolute rights, or almost absolute rights. And I think that many of you also agreed with almost everything that Giles said in principle. Yes. Thank you very much. This brings this evening's debate to an end. I'm very grateful to the panellists for having joined us, and thank you also to the audience for such good questions. We will adjourn, and further events on European matters will be held in the term that starts at the end of September.